Namaste, group hug. Please come and join us on Sofa. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Sam Bosanquet, and hopefully I've pronounced that properly. He is the Family Office Director, is that right? Family Office Services Director at Sandaire, which is a family office. In the industry, we know it well. We know and love everyone at Sandaire, but probably the wider viewers may not have heard of Sandaire. So, Sam, good morning. And please give us a rundown about Sandaire so that the viewers can get a frame of who you are and where you work.
Morning. Thank you. Yes, you actually pronounced that spot on. So well done. Yes. So I'm a director on our family office services team. So as you said, a bit about Sandaire. We're a family office for 23 families. We were founded coming up to 25 years ago now by the Scott family after they sold their insurance business, Provincial Insurance, to a group that then became part of AXA. We operate for, as I said, those 23 families and provide a very different range of service to each of them. So at one end, obviously, everyone will be familiar with the discretionary investment management offering, but we also have teams that offer real estate investment, private equity investment, and also, most importantly, the team that I sit in my opinion, the family office services team. So we coordinate tax planning, look after houses, we look after horses, whatever it is that the families need to make the complete picture work. That's the role that we're there to take care of. So as I say, come out to 25-year anniversary next year. We have a sort of rather steady business where we sort of tick along and add 1 or 2 families a year. And as I said, look to provide whatever it is that they need to make their setup work.
So today we're going to have a chat about ESG, which one of the things that Citywealth does is try not to use jargon. So this is the headline for it, so we have to, but it's to explain it to the viewer. It's environmental, social, and governance. Governance, I think so. Yep. Now, the rest of the world might know that as climate change or Greta Thunberg, but for us, what does that mean? I mean, there's a lot of confusion around this topic, isn't it? And was it just the green policies in the olden days, or is it just rebadged? What's the meaning of ESG?
Well, we like everyone have slightly different name for this. So we call it responsible investing. And what is responsible investing? If you think historically we were taught at business schools that businesses should maximize profits and they should do that at the cost of all other activities. The world has moved on since then, and now we realize that profit maximization is not the end goal of things, but there are other factors you need to consider. How sustainable is that business? What impact does it have on the environment around it? How well is it run? And that's where ESG investing comes in. It's the consideration of a wider group of factors rather than just investing for profit. And there are many different shades of that. And it's a very interesting area to be in and to be involved in. And many of our families are very active in this and very concerned about this in the world going forward.
Well, it's I did an article on it, I was saying earlier, wasn't I? But I saw that it's had billions more have gone into it. So there is now that ratchet, isn't there, which the industry needed to probably take it more seriously. And I don't mean Sandaire, but I think if there was generally a theme or feeling that I got, which was that people were talking about it, but not taking it that seriously within the industry.
That's I think that's a fair comment. I think now most people would recognize this is a direction of travel, and many would say it's a one-way street. I mean, we're unlikely to see students protesting outside their universities saying, we want you to be more reckless with the investment funds. It's just not going to happen, right? So I think before you even think about ESG and responsible investing, in my mind, the single biggest thing is, like it or not, the world is moving to a low carbon economy. Like it or not, businesses, CEOs are finding they have to now tread this tightrope between what the shareholders want and what is good for the business and what the wider world wants. And so we are going in this direction, like it or not. And so I think everyone's investment strategy, whether explicitly embedding ESG or SRI, needs to have some consideration for this in the way they invest, because that is the future. There'll be businesses that don't exist in the future because we've moved to a low carbon world. You think of all the petrol stations there are, which are going to have to transition to being charging points. You think of all the traditional sort of coal businesses, which are just not going to be here. But equally, there's an incredible array of opportunities out there. So set aside one part of wanting to do well, do good for the world, and just think this is a big trend we're having, irrespective of what people may think of it. And yes, I think now we are at the stage where people are awakening to it. The industry is getting more standards around it, which is very welcome. And I think we're generally moving forward. But that's not to say it's not without challenges, and we see many of those in the way we operate.
I'm sure you will. And so that brings us to obviously COVID and work from home. So how have you managed? And you said you were talking earlier saying your wife has a farm, and
that's correct.
Give the viewers a chat about the farm and your home life.
So I'm on this. Our sofas are quite distant at this moment in time. I'm in Herefordshire, which is on the England-Wales border. My wife's a farmer. Obviously, a lot easier for me to work from home than it is for her to work from home. Despite its name, there aren't many shepherds in Shepherd's Bush, which is where we live in London. So we've been down here for 3 months, enjoying spring. Actually, I mean, this for the farmers of this world, it's been a very wet start to the year. You know. When you're in London, you were slightly detached from the extremely bad weather we had in January and February, but up here it's very apparent. But there's been a lot of sowing crops. We've had lambing season. The apple blossoms been in the orchards, so it's been pretty fantastic actually to be here and to see it all. So it's lovely because I don't normally get to see that. So it's been lovely.
You were saying cider apples. So do you produce cider? I mean, is Sandaire like a wash with cider in the office?
I've tried pitching to the CEO a new business line in Sandaire cider, but I haven't quite got the backing yet. But no, we did.
You went to the wrong people. You should have come to us. Citywealth cider. It sounds fabulous. We could do that. So do you have cider at home?
The apples we pick go off under contract and they go into Bulmers. So if you're drinking a little bit of Bulmers cider, you might get a tiny bit of our apples, and then the rest of the farm is mostly organic vegetables. So if you go into Waitrose, you may get lucky and get one of our organic carrots.
Oh, sweet. That's really, really interesting. So let's move on to more business chat now. And clearly the economic environment, as I said earlier, thank you for joining us today. When you see the markets, so the GDP's had a 20.4% hit, hasn't it? Which is like a fifth of the economy wiped out, which is like I think much worse than people thought. But what I'm seeing is there seems to be people are sort of more worried about, the Maslow hierarchy of needs, their survival right now. So can they focus on ESG? But then there does seem for people who are in the industry, and I think others, so figureheads are coming out, aren't they, and saying, look, we've still got to stick to the long-term plan, which clearly is ESG, isn't it? So what's your thoughts about that? I mean, how are your clients reacting to the situation?
Well, I suppose what's unique to the family office world is we're not just concerned with investments, we're concerned with the whole picture of families' lives. And I'll come back to why that's relevant in a second. But when we're thinking about investments, I think that, the key thing for any of our families, and in fact for anyone out there that's investing, is we are long-term investors. So the most important thing is to set that long-term flight path, look at the picture of assets, and then downturns like these, they shouldn't come as a surprise, and a family and investor should be able to sort of weather them as they go through. So it's about having the right asset allocation. We run fire drills with all of our families to say, if markets drop 20, 30%, this is what it's going to feel like. The best bit of feedback I've had over this period is someone said, that's exactly what I expected to happen. And in our mind, that's what everyone should be aiming for. So in terms of how are they feeling at this moment in time, the good thing is most of them are pretty relaxed. And until yesterday, we had most of the sterling balance portfolios were just into positive territory, which is pretty good. And life's a bit more challenged now. I think, coming back to your point about how they feel about ESG in this environment, the parts that we've seen is most interesting is a lot of our families are hugely philanthropic. Right? I have worked for 5 families.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah,
and that dovetails quite a lot into this section. So we've we've had a number of them who give away significant amounts of money. Across my 5 families, that the total amount given away last year was approximately 80 million. They'll do the same again this year and next year, and they keep doing it. But the challenge they've found in this environment is how they select who they give that money to. If you imagine you're a charity board or a foundation, you're trying to give money away, there's a process to that. How do you evaluate a grant and impact investment opportunity? And those timescales are so much shorter because people really need that money at this moment in time. So those are the sort of challenges we're seeing. And then in the ESG space, for the socially responsible portfolios we've run, we've been pretty pleased with those, actually. You know, there's been some marginal outperformance on the SRI ETF portfolios we run for one family. We've seen green bonds perform marginally better than corporate bonds. So it's been pretty good. There are obviously factors for that.
Like what would be the factors?
Well, I think obviously in this downturn, we've had 2 things that have driven this. We're all familiar with COVID-19, but also we've had a substantial drop in the oil price. So if you think about most ESG or SRI filters, there's going to be a lower proportion of oil-related businesses in there. So they're going to have less exposure to that section of the market that's come down. So there are quirks like that, which do help them outperform at this time. But I think the message we've had time and time again from our families is they're hoping that some of the good that's come out of this, people remote commuting, people not using as much electricity as they normally would, they're really hoping that those are going to be here to stay. I mean, that would be a significant win for the world out of this. And I think we'd all agree.
So let me bring you back to the philanthropy thing. We were talking to Steve Sakic, who's one of the big bosses over at IQ-EQ. And he said one thing that's happened with some of their families is that they are committed to philanthropy plans and pledged to giving. So they're sort of the stage beyond sort of process and choosing. But there's been so much disruption in the actual charities. They've been unable to receive the funds literally through being thrown into complete, I don't want to say shambles, and I don't want to say it's of the whole charity sector, but the fact that he said it, and they said they've had to, basically all funds are stopped while they almost wait for the charities to actually regroup, to be able to get back to work, to actually receive the money to start doing work. And I think there's been some news, hasn't there, in the paper saying that a lot of aid is unable to actually get to people, beneficiaries, to help them. So have you seen any of that with your clients?
Absolutely. So one of the families I work for have a giving pledge in place. They have a family foundation. Typically, they work on a quarterly cycle for agreeing the grants they're going to give away, the new impact investments they're going to make. They've had to shift to a bi-weekly meeting to do this, simply because what they agree at the beginning of the quarter, the milestones they need the organizations to hit, they're not there because the staff aren't there, they aren't able to deliver it. But equally, there may be other organizations which need the capital a bit quicker and a bit sooner. And they've definitely found that. And I think as we've all found in the way we operate our businesses, they found adaptability is absolutely key in this, is to stick to your processes, stick to the high level principles, but we be willing to adapt so that those key organizations you support can see it through this crisis.
So it's quite hands-on, giving flexibility. I mean, you can't just be like, oh, they say this a lot, and you can't just sort of fling a few million at something and then be like, well, we didn't do it. Oh, that's rubbish. I'm never giving you any money again. I mean, it's a lot more work than it looks, isn't it, to do giving? Yeah. So the wider world, it would seem, with Extinction Rebellion, with Greta, with climate change, is pushing the agenda with ESG, isn't it? I mean, I've found with the investment industry being a bit slow to react and adapt their products and services, and this whole Greta thing with Extinction Rebellion is almost like boxed the investment industry and the government into a corner, hasn't it? Where they've actually had to come out fighting with products and like kind of jump on this. So give us a wider theme about ESG in the public and how this all translates.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. I think demand has always been there for this sector, and I think, as you say, over the last few years, it's really ballooned, and people have slightly found themselves on the back foot, and it's easy to criticize the industry as a whole, but it's actually doing responsible investing is actually quite tricky, and what do I mean by that? I mean, who chooses what good is, right? ESG is environmental, S is social, G is governance. Surely we can all just agree how to rate these companies.
But actually, it's very complicated.
It is, exactly. I mean,
well, like we were saying with the car scenario, like people would be like, "Oh, I'm not investing in these horrible cars who are using all this oil," but then they're all massive investors in EV, aren't they? Electric vehicles. So, like, how are they or aren't they? You know, and in reality, half of their company is and half of it isn't, is it? So they are winning all the awards, aren't they, for being in that camp by conforming to all of the various tests that various bodies have put out there for them.
It's exactly. I mean, and even you look at a number of heavy industries where they issue green bonds. So these are corporates which are big users of fossil fuels. They'll issue a green bond to let's say, finance a transition to a solar-powered operational or something along those lines. So you have this interesting question, like, if you rule out a certain heavy industry because it's a big consumer of power and issues a green bond, you may find yourself sort of going into a sector you didn't think you'd be in because they're in a green bond and reducing their emissions. So there's a challenge around that. But I think just coming back to choosing those companies, I mean, one of the observations we have of the industry is if you look at two of the biggest ratings agencies out there in the SRI space, you look at
so explain to the viewers what SRI is in case somebody's watching.
So it's sustainable and responsible investing. So the way I look at it is that there's different levels. If you want to invest responsibly or with sustainable responsible investing, how do you do that? You don't just score a company on its profits, you score it on its metrics of its environmental responsibility, its social responsibility, and its governance responsibility. So if you like, social or responsible investing is the title, and the factors you are scoring is along the lines of how good they are with the environment, how good they are with social awareness, how good they are with their governance. Interesting, I was doing a little bit of work the other day for a family, and if you simply look at SRI ETFs, you look at the iShares there, and you look at the top 5 companies in their US SRI ETF, right? And then you compare that to the SPDR version, right? The top 5 companies there. And bearing in mind, these top 5 companies account for 20% of a US allocation for someone investing in this. Have a guess at how many of those are the same companies between the 2 biggest rating agencies, ETF providers out there. Of those 5, you probably alarmed to it's only one company they both agree on in the top 5 is a good company, right? So
that's not helpful.
No, it's not. So when it's so it's easy. So come back to the point earlier. It's easy to say the industry's been slightly late to this, but in reality, we can't agree on what is good and what is not good, and which of those factors, E, S, or G, should have the biggest weighting. And I think one of the biggest changes coming down the line will be the EU sustainable taxonomy, which will put all of these things on a level playing field where companies within Europe will have to report on certain metrics in certain ways. And that will make evaluation a lot easier for people that are doing it.
Oh, and when is that due?
That's due to come out the next couple of years. I mean, it's I'm afraid, like all of these EU things that sort of work their way through a process, it's a bit of a rule unto itself. And they've got 1 or 2 other things on their agenda at the moment as well.
Strangely, there you go. So what about poverty and its effect? If lots of people lose their jobs, companies go bust, is the money going to drain back out of ESG funds? What do you predict?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I lost you for a second.
Sure.
Perhaps you could repeat that.
No problem. So what about poverty? And obviously the economic environment is pretty bad now, isn't it? Companies are going bust. They may not reopen. We're seeing them reopen and there's no customers. Or I went to Waitrose yesterday, there was 8 people in there. I was like, oh, it's like my personal shop now. How lovely. So if poverty, is that money going to come out of the ESG? Do you think people will sustain this forward motion if they just lose their jobs and companies go bust? I mean, will we see a contraction?
I mean, obviously, any downturn in consumption is bad for the economy, right? We'd all agree on that. I think if anything, and this is entirely speculative, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think if anything, going through these tough times, make people more aware of the companies they're choosing to support and to think, am I really wanting to be in all these industries, or do I actually want to have some discretion in this? And I think people will face that in the SRI space. As you said, there will be people who lose their jobs, a lot of people who lose their jobs from this, and it's going to be really tough times. So I think if anything, that may push this higher up the agenda of many of the big institutional investors, the big foundations, the big educational endowments. I certainly think it'll be there. It's too early to tell what that outcome will be.
So we'll have a look at industry trends now. So I wonder if there's any trends in the ESG space. I mean, is everyone running to certain types of companies or products that are sort of coming up? As you're saying, there's a top 5 that no one can agree on. So you've already given us a bit of a talk on that. But the other thing I heard was that there are a lot of, I was writing an article on this, and they said an entry point was tech startup businesses. But talking to one of our clients in Zug, he said a lot of the tech startups just disappeared. They didn't get the second round funding, quite quickly. Things that were expected to happen just didn't, and people just went, well, we're just closing the doors. So is that still a model that can work? Is that still an access route to tentatively go into this area, or do people even need to go tentatively into it? I mean, can they just rush into it now?
Well, tech's obviously a huge space, and there are a lot of industries in there and sectors and companies which are very disruptive. And I know that's a slightly cliched word, but I absolutely agree that if you want to do good with your investing, it's certainly a space you can look at. And we've seen varied degrees of success in that. What have we been in, which has been quite interesting? We've been a long-term supporter of a business called Oxford Nanopore. That's a DNA sequencer about the size of a USB stick, and it's one of the technologies that's being used to monitor COVID-19 and to detect who has it, who doesn't have it. That's obviously a winner in this situation. But equally, there's some technology businesses we went into. Particularly, I'm thinking of one which is very relevant for the retail sector and provides feedback. Who, with obviously shops being shut, they're going to be really stretched, and their cash burn is high in these businesses, and they're going to need to raise more money to keep going. We're in quite a unique position. We work for a small number of families. They think very long term. We have a very active engagement with the companies we're invested in, and we're good partners for those businesses when they turn and look to us for funding. We can be there and evaluate it. So I certainly think it's going to be difficult for a number of those tech businesses, especially those who had somewhat jam tomorrow businesses where it was never quite clear that the profits were coming. But sitting on my desk at the moment for one of the families I work for in Europe is a funding round for a really interesting technology business. Very simple. They just store some eco energy inside large batteries and release it into the grid when it's needed later on. And they've had huge amounts of success, and they're finding it quite easy to raise money at the moment. So there's definitely a split between those technology companies which are very relevant now, which are helping what we're going through, and those which are really struggling as a business model. And I think it will be difficult times for a number of those businesses.
So would you say medical was like quite a big area for ESG? I mean, I think from my memory, that was what people were saying.
I mean, it's certainly one of the sectors. For what it's worth, for us, we find it a challenge to invest into that sector. To know your way around new drugs, the release program, it can be a minefield if you get that one wrong. But obviously, there's a lot of very interesting things in their stem cell work, a lot of new drugs that can be developed. So I think it is a good, interesting sector to be looking at. But don't forget, if you're looking to invest more responsibly, there are so many simple steps you can do. I think it was the CalPERS, the great, huge American pension fund, discovered that the vast majority of their carbon emissions in their portfolio were coming out of something like 1% of the equities. And just by trimming those out, you can drastically reduce the carbon emissions associated with portfolios. So whilst it's always exciting to go towards these technologies, towards the new medical devices, the risk of failure is so high, and you've got to remember that your investments are your savings, and so trimming down a few companies that makes your portfolio a lot more carbon friendly versus taking big gambles are quite different things to do, and you need to think about them in your overall strategy.
So really your advice for anyone watching would be do a little bit of housekeeping on your own financial affairs first, and assessment, and maybe have a talk with your financial advisor and just say, well, what am I doing? And then at least they've got some talk, haven't they? To say, well, look, I've improved my where my money's investing, so that they could even say, can't they, 10% improvement in my output of carbon or whatever it is. So carrying on then, so electric vehicles, it's just that seems to be Mr. Tesla's doing very well, isn't he? Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And interesting point you live in the country, but I've heard that a lot of the out of town electric charging stations are broken, not working, inability to charge. So there does seem like it's not just buying a car, is it? There just seems to be a lot of necessity in sort of internal structure. Is that something the government has to do, or do the car companies have to take that full on?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, when you look at basic infrastructure across our country, I mean, the rural communities are only just getting good broadband across the UK. I mean, so to hope that they're going to have electric charging points is pretty ambitious, actually. So I think it's got to be a combination of government and industry working together to roll that out. There'll be interesting opportunities for people. Again, I was talking about that battery storage company a minute ago. They're providing electric buses across the country, which is a great thing rather than burning diesel. So I think electric cars are really interesting from an emissions standpoint. The challenge with them is when you look at the disposal of the batteries inside those cars, it is not very environmentally friendly, right? So you have to think about the full life cycle of those products.
And I don't know, maybe you don't know, maybe this is a question too far, but I was thinking this morning about actually their production of the cars, whether that's actually environmentally friendly. I mean, the output is environmentally friendly, isn't it? But is what goes into making the car, do you know?
Oh goodness. Well, I mean, again, you have all the challenges of the battery industry, all the rare earth elements that you need to go in there, which are generally mined in parts of the world which are not great for governance, and so there is all sorts of challenges with this. When we look at clients' portfolios, we rate the investments on sort of traffic light system. We meet with every manager and evaluate it, and that's useful, and we can get a carbon number to things. But when we look at that analysis, there are so many limitations to it, and I think that's what all SRI investors will realize, is there are limitations to this. But when you look at the different types of carbons that are included, someone makes a car, it may be relative, or in fact, think of an airline, it's probably a good example. Someone makes an airplane, it's the making of the airplane only uses up a certain amount of carbon, but the carbon that airplane uses and emits is vast. And people aren't very good at tracking back all of the carbon emissions and the environmental impact of the product that they have in front of them. The plastic glass you have there, what is it really made from, and how is it extracted?
Well, I do know, because it's a Schroders one, and they had to look into it before they. It's actually made of cane, isn't it? What was this made of? But it was shipped from China, so I did say. Interesting. So sorry, Schroders, for that, but I think it's made of sugar cane or something like that. Brilliant. So actually, and it actually is very light. So I have to say they did do a good job. But then, as I think your point is, isn't it, that even though that is great and I've used it, and although all the shops are now not taking reusable cups, change with COVID, it did come from China. So how many planes or ships did it carbon emit to bring that product to Marylebone? Who knows? So give us a lowdown on your services personally, or the family offices division, so that people have got an idea of what it means to work or partner with Sandaire, or put their money with you.
So I think that the key differentiator between family offices and investment houses, if you like, so private banks or investment managers, is we're really there to deal with the totality of a family's wealth. So if you think of investing a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, you put together the pieces and you get an overall risk picture that you want. You need to think of a family office more like a Rubik's Cube, right? You can put together one side to get the picture you want, like a jigsaw puzzle, but there's the other aspects, the other dimensions that come into it, the property investments, the tax planning, the family governance. And each time you move one of those pieces, the whole shape changes. And so that's what our services are built around. When families come to us with a series of properties that needed to be evaluated, looked at, disposed, they want to be making direct investments into private companies, or they need someone to just look after the administration in their life, the family investment companies that are there, the trusts that have been set up, the horses or the houses that need to be looked after, insured, bills paid for. That's what our business really caters to. And there's very few people out there that do it to the same degree that we do. A small snippet, but a number of our families left London, unsurprisingly, during this crisis, and they've been at home in the countryside, and we have a security service that goes around all of their houses checking that they're okay, right?
Yeah.
And little things like that make a difference between a family office and investment managers. It's understanding that big picture, the whole shape of a family's affairs.
And what are your clients ringing you about during COVID? I mean, let's assume they're not ringing to go, have I lost all my money? Because we'll put that as a green light tick. They didn't. But are the concerns? We've had a couple of different ideas coming from the various people we've spoken to. But what are they saying to you?
So there's a number of things we've had going on. We talked earlier about philanthropy and the challenges they're facing in that. But there's been a number of business as usual things. We bought a house to one of our clients and moved them during this period, which is incredible when you think of how difficult it is to get removal men around and things like that. There's a number of fears that are on their mind. As long-term investors, they're obviously thinking about where the world is going, and there's different sides to that. Will we see high inflation, the value of money eroded? Will we see businesses going bust and companies being really impacted by that? So we're working with them on those sides. I think there's also a fear of who's going to pay for all the measures we'd had, and it normally falls on the broader shoulders. We know that. So it's about evaluating what you have. The other, I suppose, last part we've seen is people with the rise in the death rate we've had. People have become very aware of their mortality, and we're in the process of updating wills.
Very big theme, yeah.
It is, yeah. So all families need to know that their wills are updated, that they've got their powers of attorney in place, that it all works, and people know what's going to happen. And we do a very detailed job of going through that and making sure that everything is up to date and everyone does know what's going to happen, who should know. So it's certainly one of those housekeeping things we've been busy on.
Yeah, so some reassurance, I suppose. And so post-COVID, so your clients are worried about inflation, which is a genuine concern. Taxing of the rich looks like a great possibility, doesn't it, coming down the line to pay for all the bailout? So what's your view 2 to 5 years post-COVID? Where do you see? I know that's a crystal ball stuff, and none of us can predict, and we'll all throw ourselves under the bus. But what do you think?
Well, there's many different areas to think about there. I mean, if we're talking about investments, as I said, we are long-term investors. We think about long-term plans for families. So it comes back to having that long-term allocation that people want, and that we always believe is the best way to adapt to whatever is thrown at you by markets over the next few years. I think it's very difficult to predict where we're going to be in 2 or 3 years' time. I think there's going to be a number of social changes on the back of this. We're all working from home. You're working from home. It wouldn't surprise me if we see a greater element of that. So for our family.
So what other social changes do you see then? As you mentioned a few.
Yeah. So obviously we talked about the commuting element there, but I think people are more aware of their society around them, and that will be a good thing. I think I like to think people will be more socially aware. That will be more giving to local charities, more community interaction. My street in London, obviously we aren't there at the moment, but there's a WhatsApp group, and everyone is actually offering to shop for the elderly couples on the street. I mean, for years we've gone by where we don't know our neighbours in London. That's got to be a good thing, right?
Yeah.
That we're actually interacting. So maybe the world is going to find itself in a sort of closer knit community where we're a bit more caring for each other. And maybe this is the advent finally of the big society that governments wanted, and that we're actually going along that path. And I said, as for investments, we'll just hope that all the different irons we have on the fire will work out in the right measures for the families we work for.
So as things have seemed to, as you're saying, as we've become more about being caring and money less important, sort of maximising profits, all that kind of stuff. And there's been some quite savage response from businesses, hasn't there, to in hospitality, for instance. I know that some people were just told, you're not getting any pay before furlough was announced. And they're literally like, you can all go home. And then we'll kind of backtracked onto furlough afterwards, after a few weeks, when they realised the government was going to pay. There's been some pretty savage behaviour, hasn't there? Which I think will come back to bite people. But I mean, how do you see all this kind of panning out with these kind of industries?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, and this goes to this wider concept of having regard for your stakeholders around you. So you probably referring to there was that rather incredible hotel business at the beginning of this lockdown who fired all of their staff and turfed them out on the street while we were going into lockdown. And then most of them were from Europeans. They had nowhere to live, nowhere to be, and we were literally on the street at the start of lockdown. And you can't help but think that's not going to be very good for their business model in the world going forward, that the consumers will remember that their reviews online will reflect that. And I think in this world of investing going forward, big companies are going to think about how they're perceived by the totality of their stakeholders. And so I do think that's going to have an impact on things.
I mean, it would seem that it would be the kind of marker to open the gates a bit more for ESG, wouldn't it? I mean, in theory, if less importance on money and more on caring, that would seem to be the ESG model, isn't it? Is there enough out there, enough funds and things? Because what somebody said is that some of them are horribly expensive. So you're putting your money into third-party funds, but there's some of them are oversubscribed or incredibly expensive, and you've got to put those fees onto your client or absorb them, and they're almost pricing themselves out of the market. I mean, so how does that translate into a huge rush? It's a bit like the pension funds, isn't it? I mean, if the market goes that big, are there people there to serve that market?
I think there's plenty of choice out there. In fact, if anything, I see there's been a sort of a flood of ESG investments that have come out, or funds that are there. I mean, how do we think about it? I think the industry as a whole is facing fee pressures, and we see those management fees coming down and down, which is generally good for consumers. But I think what we have found quite interesting in that sector, as I said earlier, we evaluate all the funds we invest in and give them a sort of traffic-like rating system. Is the challenge with ESG and investing on this is it sort of favors the large firms. And by that, I mean, if you're a huge global investment organization, you can set up an SRI team overnight. You've got the budget to do it. You can put people in there to produce as many reports as you want on the different funds and how they're doing. And there can be two different things to this. We found there's some really small firms. We have a manager we give money to in Japan who really cares about this, but they don't advertise it as an SRI or ESG fund. And for example, when they're evaluating the value of a company, they apply a different discount rate to an underlying entity that has got a more sustainable business model. And that's interesting, the fact that they're actually valuing businesses in different ways depending on how good they are in those scoring categories. But to the outside world that didn't spend their time digging into the details of that fund, they might not know that actually it's quite a good fund from an ESG perspective. So there's that challenge there as well for consumers. Your fund manager may be doing this already, but isn't advertising it, versus the very large firms who have got the budget to say they're doing all these things. And you're never quite sure how much it's really going on.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Sam, for joining us. It's been a great chat, and it's a really interesting topic moving forward, isn't it? And people have got a bit of time with COVID now, haven't they, to have a good old think about this and do their research. I'm sure you've probably got some articles on your website they can have a look at. If the viewers would like to press the thumbs up if they enjoyed a chat with Sam today, and if you would like to subscribe, there is a subscribe button on the bottom of the channel, and you can join us on Tuesdays and Fridays at 11. So thank you so much, Sam, with a crazy day with the market. So we look forward to seeing you after COVID, and hope you have a good day. Happy Friday.
Thank you very much.